Grant Hollis walked away from millions, leaving behind the empire he had built. In the silence of his childhood home, surrounded by memories of lessons learned and promises once broken, he discovers a letter that could change everything. A letter to Ivy, the girl who once held his heart. Little did he know, this simple act of reflection would lead him back to love, to choices that matter, and to a life defined not by profit, but by connection. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. I've learned the sea forgives no one, not even a boy who meant well. The years have taken much from me. Strength in my hands, steadiness in my legs, clarity in my eyes. But what they haven't taken is memory. Memory lingers like salt on the tongue, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter. And some nights when the wind claws at my windows and the surf hammers the rocks below, memory drags me back to that night when the light went dark. It was the storm that set everything in motion. The sky itself seemed split apart, torn by white veins of lightning. The air smelled of iron and ozone. Waves taller than houses beat themselves to froth against the cliffs. And above it all, standing, stubborn against the fury of the sea, was the lighthouse, its beams sweeping in ragged arcs across black water, warning ships to stay away from the teeth of the coast. But even a lighthouse is not immune to fault. Even steel and stone have their weaknesses. That night, the lamp flickered. I remember the sound as much as the sight, the glass chiming with each tremor, the bell of the tower tolling under the weight of the gale. I was just a boy, barely more than 13, clutching something in my hand that mattered more than the storm, more than the sea, more than the command my father had just given me. A letter, sealed in red wax, edges sharp against my damp palm. The ink inside still fresh, my handwriting. My heart poured onto paper. I had written it by lamplight in my small room, scrawling down words I hadn't dared say aloud. It was a promise, a confession, a vow I thought would change everything, if only I could deliver it. But my father's voice cut through the roar of the wind. "Stay put, Grant. Do you hear me? You stay put." He was keeper of the light, a man of stone and ritual, his life measured in wicks trimmed, lenses polished, oil filled. He believed in order, in doing what was commanded, in never, ever abandoning the lamp. And in that moment, he wanted his boy safe indoors, away from the screaming night. But youth does not bend so easily. Youth believes it knows better. Youth hears the thunder as a dare, not a warning. And so when he turned his back, I slipped from the safety of the keeper's quarters, clutching the letter like a lifeline. The rain came sideways, 1,000 needles biting into my face. My boots slipped on the stones. I pushed against the tower door, but it would not open. Swollen wood, jammed hinges, or perhaps something else, something I wouldn't understand until years later. All I knew then was that I could not force it, no matter how I strained. The letter bled in my hand. Raindrops smudged the ink, blurring names and promises into a wash of black and blue. I cupped my palm over it, desperate to shield it, but the storm was merciless. And then, through the curtain of water, I saw it. A figure, a silhouette standing at the edge of the rocks, half lit in the sweep of the beacon. They were waiting for me, or for what I carried, waiting for the words I had never spoken. Every instinct screamed that if I could just reach them, if I could just press this letter into their hand, everything would be different. I stumbled forward, my heart thundering louder than the sea. And then the light went out, only for a heartbeat. Barely a breath, but long enough for me to lose sight. Long enough for the silhouette to vanish into the black. And when the lamp flared back to life, casting its desperate beam over the rocks, they were gone. I shouted. My voice was swallowed whole by the wind. I tore at the door again, but it would not give. The bell clanged overhead, tolling some warning I could not decipher. And then I looked down. The letter The wax was still unbroken, though the paper was sodden, the ink running like tears. My hands shook as I clutched it to my chest, as if I could keep its words alive by sheer will. But the truth is, I never delivered it. Not that night. Not ever. The storm passed, as storms always do. The morning sun rose pink over calm waters, but the figure on the rocks never returned. The keeper who should have relieved my father never came. And my father's pocket watch, always wound, always precise, was found the next day stopped at 2:17. Years have gone by, decades. The boy I was grew into a man, and the man into the old voice you hear now. The sea carved me as surely as it carves the cliffs. I became things I swore I wouldn't. I lost people I swore I'd hold on to. But through it all, one thing has never changed: this letter. I keep it still, tucked in the inside pocket of my coat, the red seal cracked but never broken. Sometimes I take it out and trace the lines of my younger self's handwriting, blurred though they are. Sometimes I imagine what might have been if the door had opened, if the light had held, if the silhouette had remained when the beam returned. But the sea does not forgive. It remembers every broken promise, every unmailed word, every moment of hesitation. And so do I. That night, when the light went dark, something in me went dark with it. And though I have spent a lifetime trying to rekindle it, the truth is plain. The boy who meant well left the lighthouse in the storm, but he never truly came back. Still, I keep the envelope. Still, I remember. Because somewhere once someone was waiting, and I never arrived. I was born in a house that faced the sea, though house may be too generous a word. It was more a stubborn wooden box planted into rock, its clapboards forever groaning under the push of the wind, its windows etched with a film of salt that no rag could ever fully wipe away. The roof leaked when storms pressed in, and the floorboards sang with every step, but it was home. My father built it with his own hands, and he built it not for grandeur, but for survival. Timber over tin, he used to say. Wood flexes where metal breaks. He believed that strength was not in shine or polish, but in how well something could weather a gale. That house weathered plenty, so did he. The hearth was always warm in winter, fed by logs he cut himself. The cupboards were rarely full, but there was bread, butter, and jars of pickled vegetables from our small garden. The air smelled of smoke and sea, salt and stew. There were only 2 bedrooms, his and mine, but somehow it never felt cramped. We lived with less, but we lived with enough. Ivy would come by often. Even as a girl, she carried herself like someone who belonged more to the future than the present. She had that kind of quiet gravity, the kind that made you forget the roughness of her patched dress or the ink smudges on her fingertips. Ivy always had ink on her fingers. She read more than anyone I knew, books borrowed from the little village. Library whose shelves leaned like tired men, but still held whole worlds inside them. She never read just for herself. She pressed ivy leaves, real ones, plucked from the hedgerows, between the pages, and slipped the books back, leaving small green signatures behind, as if to say, I was here, and I cared enough to leave a mark. When I asked her why she did it, she shrugged. So people know the book mattered to someone. So it isn't lonely. I didn't understand it then. Books seemed like things beyond loneliness. They were objects, not people. But Ivy never made that kind of distinction. She treated paper and ink with the same tenderness she treated stray dogs, bruised knees, or the lonely widows on our street. My father approved of her, though he would never say so directly. He had a way of hiding his kindness beneath gruffness, like a candle kept under a jar. He'd hand her apples from our barrel, or sharpen her pencils without a word, or show her how to polish brass without scratching the surface. For me, his lessons were sterner. People over profit, he'd say, every time the merchants came. Through town peddling tinware that glimmered prettier than wood, but lasted half as long. Timber over tin. Remember that, Grant. Not everything that shines is worth the cost. What holds steady is what matters. He was keeper of the light, and the lighthouse was both his duty and his sermon. The lamp had to burn, night after night, storm after storm. It was not just a signal for ships. It was a covenant, he said. A promise made to every sailor who set eyes on its beam. You are seen, and you are warned, and you are not alone. The light is a promise kept, he'd repeat, his hand resting on my shoulder as if pressing the words into me. I half listened, half dreamed, because I was a boy and the smell of the sea was always calling me elsewhere. Still, the words stayed. The words always stayed. One evening, when Ivy was with us, my father spread maps across the table. His finger traced the lines of longitude and latitude, showing us how the world was stitched together by bearings and stars. He held his pocket watch up to the light, its case dented from years of falls, its glass scratched, but still it ticked. Steady, he showed us how to align the watch with the sun to find north. Ivy listened as if the secrets of the universe were being poured into her hands. I listened only half, more interested in the way her hair slipped loose from its braid. But it wasn't always lessons. Childhood is made of games too, and Ivy and I made the most of our little stretch of coast. We raced along the dunes, built forts out of driftwood, played explorers in the tide pools where crabs scuttled like soldiers and starfish clung like sentinels. She was sharper than I was, quicker with ideas, always finding the hidden shell or the tide's rhythm before I did. I didn't mind. She had a way of making victory feel like something shared. Until the day I forgot to share. The school had a small prize for an essay contest, nothing grand, just a ribbon and the pride of it. Ivy and I had written together, nights spent scratching lines in candlelight, her ideas pouring faster than my ink could catch them. When the essay won, I was called up alone. I accepted the ribbon, smiled for the class, and never spoke her name. I can still see her face in that moment, still silent, eyes that didn't accuse, but didn't shine either. That was worse than anger. It was the first small betrayal, though I didn't call it that then. I told myself I'd make it up to her, but time has a way of sweeping such promises under the rug. She never brought it up. I never apologized. But the silence between us gained a crack that day, thin as a hairline fracture in glass. You don't notice it at first. But with time, it spreads. Years turned. And then came the letter from the city, a scholarship, my chance to leave the coast and study, to be more than the son of a keeper, to prove myself in the world beyond our horizon. The night before I left, Ivy came to me with a gift. It was a notebook, hand-stitched, its pages blank and waiting. She pressed it into my hands, her ink-stained fingers leaving smudges on the cover. Write truth, not speeches, she told me. I laughed it off then, thinking she was being dramatic. But there was no drama in her eyes, only quiet conviction. She meant it. She always meant it. My father's gift was different. He took the watch from his pocket, the same dented, battered piece of brass he had carried every day of my life, and placed it in my palm. Keep it honest, he said. Just that, nothing more. His words were never more than they needed to be. The next morning, I stood at the train station with the notebook in my satchel, the watch in my pocket, and an ivy leaf pressed between the pages of my ticket book. 3 talismans, 3 promises. When I left, I told myself I'd come back a better man. I came back richer. The older I grow, the more I understand how little we see when we are young. A boy notices the color of the sea, the shape of a cloud, the sound of laughter. But he doesn't notice the hairline cracks forming in the walls of the life he thinks will last forever. He doesn't notice when silence becomes heavier than words. Back then, I believed my world was solid. Father, Ivy, the lighthouse, 3 pillars that could not break. I was wrong, of course. But it would take years before the truth revealed itself. Years before I learned that everything steady carries within it a seam waiting to split. Ivy was the gentlest of the three, and the strongest too. I think even my father knew it though. He never admitted such things. He had his creed: people over profit, timber over tin, and he lived by it like scripture. But Ivy lived by something deeper. She had no creed, no slogans, just kindness. She gave away her lunch to children who came with none. She lingered after lessons to help the slowest reader in the room. She picked wildflowers and tucked them on the steps of the widows who had no visitors. She did all this without ever asking for notice. I used to wonder what drove her. Once, when we were walking the shore, I asked, "You always do things for people. Don't you ever get tired of it?" She thought for a moment, her bare feet sinking into wet sand. "The sea takes enough from people," she said finally. "Somebody should give something back." That was Ivy, 10 years old, and already speaking with the quiet certainty of a philosopher. I laughed at her then, teased her for sounding like an old woman. But later, lying awake in my bed, I thought of her words. And though I'd never admit it, they planted themselves in me. My father, too, carried his convictions like anchors. He hated shortcuts. He hated anything that smelled of greed. I remember him refusing a merchant who offered to buy our firewood for twice its worth. "It's winter," he said. "You'll sell it for thrice in the city. People here need it more." I argued with him, of course. I was at that age when money gleamed brighter than principle. "Why not take the price? We could buy more." He shook his head. "Profit's a trickster. You chase it, you end up empty. You give to people, you end up rich." I didn't believe him then. I thought he was stubborn, small-minded, clinging to his little moral sayings because he had never seen the world. And maybe part of me envied him too, the way his words seemed to steady him like ballast, while I felt adrift in currents I couldn't name. But Ivy believed him. She absorbed his lessons like sunlight. She sat at his table, chin propped on. Her palm, eyes bright as he spoke of the lamp, of duty, of promises kept. And he looked at her differently than he looked at anyone else. Quiet approval, almost pride. As though he knew she would carry his light further than I ever could. That made me restless. I wanted to prove myself, to show that I too could hold the weight of his creed, that I too could live by promises. But more often than not, I stumbled. The essay prize was only one example. There were others. Like the time Ivy and I were tasked with organizing the library's collection for the village fair. She worked for hours, carefully stitching labels, arranging stacks by subject, pressing ivy leaves into the books to mark the sections. I grew bored, left her there, and joined the boys outside in a game of ball. When the fair opened, the mayor commended me for bringing order to the chaos. I smiled, accepted his handshake, and let Ivy fade into the background. She never scolded me. That was the worst of it. She only smiled faintly, her ink-stained hands folded in her lap. I told myself I'd share the credit later, but of course, I never did. Pride makes promises that shame never keeps. Even then, I think I knew I was failing her in small ways. And maybe I convinced myself I'd make it up one day, in some grand gesture. That's the problem with children. We believe the future will always give us another chance. But the future does not owe us anything. The night before I left for the city, I remember Ivy's gift more clearly than any farewell. The notebook, hand-stitched, its blank pages a dare. "Write truth, not speeches," she said, her voice steady though her fingers trembled. I didn't understand what she feared. To me, words were easy things, tools to be wielded. To her, they were sacred. And she was asking me not to betray them. My father's gift followed. The dented watch, ticking still, its hands worn from years of winding. "Keep it honest," he said. No lecture, no sermon. Just 3 words pressed into my palm like iron, 2 gifts. One from a girl who believed in me more than I deserved. One from a man who believed in honesty more than anything else. And me, I believed in leaving. The scholarship was my ticket out, proof that I could rise above our small shore town, above the smell of fish and smoke, above the salt-stained windows of our home. I wanted the world, the city, the weight of ambition. I told myself I'd return. Stronger, wiser, a better son, a better friend. When the train whistle blew, I boarded with the notebook in my satchel, the watch in my pocket, and the faint impression of Ivy's ivy leaf tucked in one of my books. I waved as the train pulled. Away, her figure small on the platform, my father's shoulders squared against the wind. I thought it was a beginning. It was an ending. Because though I promised myself I would come back a better man, the truth was simpler, colder. I came back richer. The train pulled me farther from home than I'd ever been, but I remember looking back through the rattling glass and seeing my father and Ivy as if they'd been carved into the landscape. He stood tall, arms crossed, his silhouette as unbending as the lighthouse he tended. She stood smaller, shoulders hunched against the wind, her hand lifted in a farewell that felt too fragile for the weight it carried. Then the curve of the track took them from sight. For a long time afterward, I told myself I carried them with me. The watch ticked steady against my chest, the notebook lay blank in my satchel, and the faint press of an ivy leaf flattened between paper seemed to breathe when I opened it. They were talismans, I thought, anchors to home. But anchors do little good if you cut the rope. At the academy, the world came at me fast and loud. Stone buildings that swallowed the sky, professors with booming voices, students who spoke in polished phrases I had never heard in my village. Ambition was the air they breathed, and I inhaled it greedily. For the first time, I felt both small and hungry. The notebook sat on my desk waiting. Every night I opened it, pen poised, but words rarely came. Write truth, not speeches, Ivy had said. But truth is heavy, and speeches are light. And in a world where light words carried farther, I often chose them instead. I filled a few pages with half-formed thoughts, scribbled drafts of essays, polished arguments meant to impress rather than reveal. The rest remained blank, the silence of it pressing against me like a reproach. The watch, too, ticked faithfully, its dented case dull beside the gleaming pocket pieces of the other students. They teased me for it, called it the relic. I laughed along, though inside I felt the sting. I could have traded it for a newer model, shinier, precise. But each time I touched its worn surface, I felt my father's calloused hands, his simple creed, keep it honest. So I held on to it, though I sometimes wished I didn't. And the ivy leaf? It grew brittle, its veins etched like cracks in glass. Once green, it faded to brown, its edges curled. But I could not throw it away. I pressed it tighter between pages. A fragment of something I barely understood, her kindness, her steadiness, the quiet promise that someone once believed in me. Those three things lived with me through the years, but they did not guide me. I let ambition chart my course instead. I told myself I would write to Ivy, send her words from the city, but the letters were short, rushed, full of triumphs rather than truths. She answered in kind, polite but distant. A fracture widened between us, one I barely noticed at the time. My father's letters were shorter still, his handwriting jagged as if pressed through stone. Work hard, do good, keep the light. He never said he missed me. He never asked when I would return. That was his way, love dressed as duty. And me? I convinced myself I was becoming the man I had promised to be. Educated, worldly, capable. But when I returned years later, with wealth in my pocket and words polished enough to charm a boardroom, I realized the truth. I had not returned better. I had returned richer. The old house by the shore looked smaller then, its wood more weathered, the salt on the window panes thicker than I remembered. My father's hair had thinned, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes remained sharp, the same stern lightkeeper gaze that saw through storms and through suns alike. Ivy was no longer a girl with ink-stained fingers. She was a woman with her own bearing, her kindness intact but tempered, her smile quieter, her eyes less quick to shine. She carried herself as though she had waited for something once and learned not to anymore. It was then I realized how much weight those childhood tokens had carried and how lightly I had borne them. The notebook remained mostly empty, a testament to truths unwritten. The watch ticked on, but I had not kept it honest. And the ivy leaf was brittle, nearly dust, because I had pressed it between ambition and neglect. Memory is cruel that way. It returns not to comfort, but to correct. When I think back to those years by the sea, I see now what I could not then. The cracks were always there, the fracture lines in my pride, the silence in my friendship, the distance in my father's. Stoicism, the salt on the window panes, was more than residue from the sea. It was the film of time itself, blurring what was inside from what was outside, warning that no house, no matter how sturdy, can remain untouched. And yet, even through the blur, some images remain sharp. Ivy, placing an ivy leaf in a borrowed book so it would never be lonely. My father, lifting the lamp's lens until it caught the fire and turned it into a beam across the sea. My own hand clutching a ribbon I hadn't earned, smiling as though I had. These are the images that built me, for better or worse. These are the images I carried away when I boarded that train. When I left, I tell you now, I told myself I'd come back a better man. And I did come back, but not better. I came back richer. If you had looked at me, the man I had become, you might have thought I was the picture of success. The headline said so. Hollis, the gentleman CEO. The kind of title that sounds flattering, though it hides as much as it reveals. Gentle in public, yes. Polished words, careful gestures, a reputation for balancing profits with philanthropy. But no headline ever spoke of the exhaustion carved into my bones. No profile ever described the way silence felt in the penthouse at night, or how even applause can sound hollow when it's bought with compromise. I was the man in the tailored suit, the man at the head of the glass table, the man quoted in annual reports. And yet every time I checked my pocket watch, still my father's dented one, still ticking faithfully, I felt a quiet discord. A reminder that the creed I was raised on had become blurred, pressed thin beneath layers of spin, branding, and shareholder smiles. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and ambition. We sat around a table that gleamed like a mirror, each chair filled by someone whose cufflinks cost more than my father's monthly wages once had. At the far end was Mercer Chief Financial Officer, rival in everything but name. His jaw was sharp, his voice sharper. He believed in velocity, in striking first and asking questions later. He had a phrase he repeated often enough to etch it into the company's walls. Speed beats sentiment. He said it the way my father once said, the light is a promise kept. With conviction, with certainty, as if it were a law of nature. Mercer had built his empire of numbers on that creed, and the board adored him for it. That morning a memo slid across the table toward me, crisp as the collar of Mercer's shirt. I knew before I opened it what it would contain. Whispers had traveled through the corridors, rumors of efficiency initiatives, streamlining strategies. The kind of words that soften cruelty with syllables. I broke the seal anyway. Read the lines anyway. It was worse than rumor. Layoffs in the thousands. Plants shuttered. Automation to replace human hands. And all of it disguised beneath a gloss of future-proofing. To mask the bloodletting, they proposed a campaign, a charity video, a show of community care. Smile for the camera while the livelihoods of families collapsed off screen. My stomach knotted as I read. I heard Mercer clear his throat. It's the only path forward. Margins are tightening. The market is watching. If we hesitate, we bleed. I kept my eyes on the page. And the people? The people adapt or they move on, Mercer said. His tone was smooth, dismissive. Our responsibility is to the shareholders. I thought of my father, hunched over maps, his finger tracing lines that led sailors home. People over profit, timber over tin. His voice echoed in my chest even as the boardroom waited in silence, eyes fixed on me, waiting for their gentleman, CEO, to nod politely, to bless the execution. But I didn't. I folded the memo, slid it back across the table, and leaned back in my chair. Not yet, Mercer arched an eyebrow. Not yet? We stall the vote, I said. I want to visit the plants myself, speak with the people this affects. A ripple of impatience stirred through the room. Someone coughed. Another shuffled papers. Mercer smiled, the kind of smile that cuts without showing teeth. Grant, with respect, that's sentiment talking. We don't have time for sentiment. I didn't flinch. Then we'll make time. It was the first crack, the first moment I defied them openly. The kind of moment that shifts the air in a room, when everyone senses something has changed, though no one yet says it aloud. Mercer's smile hardened. You're putting feelings above strategy. I touched the pocket watch in my coat, felt its steady tick. My father's creed, Ivy's compass. A boy's half-forgotten promises. Sometimes, I said quietly, feelings are the strategy. The board didn't cheer. They didn't nod in respect. They only looked at me as though I had spoken in a language they didn't care to learn, but I held my ground. For once, I did not give them the easy nod, the polished compromise. That night, alone in my office, I looked out over the city, 1,000 lights blinking like a false constellation. Success glittered everywhere, but it was tin, not timber. The walls hummed with air conditioning, the glass gleamed, the floor was polished marble, but none of it felt steady. None of it felt honest. I pulled the notebook from the bottom drawer of my desk, the one Ivy had given me all those years ago. Its cover was frayed now, its pages mostly empty. I flipped to the front, where her handwriting lingered faintly on the first page. Write truth, not speeches. I set my pen down and tried to write, but only one sentence came. They want me to break people for profit. I stared at it for a long time, the ink drying under the sterile light. And I knew then, a storm was coming. The plant was 3 hours outside the city, set among fields that once grew corn but now stretched bare, the soil exhausted by seasons of overwork. The factory itself rose like a giant skeleton, steel beams, smokestacks, windows smudged with the residue of years. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't efficient, but it was alive. I walked through the gates with only a few aides in tow, no cameras, no press. Word had spread fast that the CEO was coming though, and the workers stood straighter than usual, their eyes flicking between me and the floor. I knew that look. It was the look of people bracing for bad news. The plant manager, a thick-armed man named Keene, led me past the assembly lines. The air smelled of oil and heat, the kind of smell that clings to a person's clothes long after the shift ends. Machines clattered, belts whirred, men and women moved with practiced rhythm. These were not faceless numbers on a memo. They were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. Each hand I passed belonged to someone who carried a mortgage, a family, a life, balanced on the fragile edge of a paycheck. We stopped by a welding station where sparks flew like angry fireflies. The welder lifted his mask, sweat streaking his forehead, and squinted at me. "You're the boss, huh?" he asked, his voice carrying both fatigue and defiance. "I am," I said. He studied me a moment, then shrugged. "Heard we're all getting replaced by machines." I hesitated, glanced at Keene, then back at the man. "That's what some want. That's why I'm here. To see before I decide." He gave a dry laugh. "Decisions get made in glass towers, not here." Something in me stung. "Maybe they shouldn't," I said quietly. The welder looked at me again, longer this time. Then he lifted a gloved hand and tapped the lamp above his station, a battered thing that flickered faintly. My old man used to say, if a light's worth keeping, you keep it lit. Doesn't matter how many storms hit. Doesn't matter if it costs you. A promise is a promise. My chest tightened. Those were my father's words. Almost exactly. The light is a promise kept. I walked further through the plant, hearing variations of the same refrain in the voices of the workers' stories of fathers, mothers, old keepers of craft who believed people came before prophets. These were not ivy's pressed leaves, but they were cut from the same cloth. Small, quiet acts of faith against the grind of a world that wanted to strip them bare. When I left the plant that day, my mind was set. I would fight the board. I would stall their vote until I could no longer stall, and then I would stand against it outright. But Mercer had anticipated me. 2 days later, a video leaked. It showed me standing with the welder, listening, nodding, saying the words, maybe they shouldn't. The clip was edited, stripped of its context, framed as weakness. CEO admits indecision. The narrative spread like fire. Analysts mocked me on financial channels. Shareholders panicked. The stock dipped, then plunged. I watched it unfold on screens in the penthouse, the city skyline gleaming behind me like a taunt. For years I had cultivated the image of calm, reliable leadership. And in one 40-second clip, it was torn apart. The board convened an emergency session, transition discussion, they called it. A polite phrase for execution. Mercer leaned forward across the table, his cufflinks catching the light. You see, Grant? Speed beats sentiment. You hesitated, and the market punished us. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something else: clarity. For the first time in years, the noise of the boardroom fell silent in my head, and I heard only my father's voice, low and certain. Keep it honest. I touched the watch in my pocket. Its steady tick felt louder than the arguments around me. They thought they were preparing to strip me of my crown. What they didn't know was that I had already laid it down in my heart. The board gathered in the largest conference hall, a room of glass walls and cold air that overlooked the city, like a throne over its domain. I had sat at the head of that table for years, the view behind me serving as both crown and shield. But on that day, I felt no pride. The skyline glittered in the distance, and all I could think was how hollow it looked, like tin polished to blind the eye. The directors sat in their tailored rows, murmuring among themselves, papers stacked neatly in front of them like ammunition. At the far end was Mercer, posture perfect, eyes sharp with victory. He knew this was his day. He had engineered it with precision. The leak, the panic, the plunge in shares. I was simply the final piece to move off the board. The chairman cleared his throat. Mr. Hollis, the agenda is transition. The word hung in the air, transition. They made it sound smooth, dignified, as if they weren't preparing to cut me from the mast and cast me adrift. Mercer smiled faintly, then spoke for the room. Grant, you've been a fine face for the company, polished, adored. But markets are merciless, and leadership must be merciless with them. Your hesitation cost us billions. Our shareholders need reassurance, and reassurance requires strength. I let the silence sit for a moment. I felt the watch in my pocket, ticking steady. I thought of Ivy's notebook, still mostly blank in my drawer. I thought of my father, trimming the wick of a lamp in the teeth of a storm. The light is a promise kept. I rose to my feet. The chair scraped softly against the polished floor. All eyes turned to me. For once, I did not rehearse, did not polish, did not spin. If profit means breaking people, I said, my voice even steady, you can keep it. The room froze. It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't even much of a speech at all. But it was the truest thing I had said in years. And I felt it leave my chest like a weight lifting. I pulled the envelope with my resignation across the table and placed it in front of the chairman. The paper looked fragile against the gleaming wood, but it was final, binding, irreversible. "I resign, effective immediately," I said. The murmurs started, then shock, disbelief, a few half-hearted protests. But Mercer only leaned back in his chair, smile widening. He had won, and he knew it. Only he didn't understand. This wasn't his victory. It was mine. Because for the first time in decades, I was walking away on my own terms. The board moved to procedural matters, interim leadership, crisis communication, damage control. Their voices blurred into a low hum as I gathered my few things. A cardboard box, absurd in its simplicity, held the sum of my personal office life. A framed photograph of the lighthouse, a brass pen that never worked properly, and the stitched notebook Ivy had given me. I placed the watch carefully in my pocket, heavier now than ever before. I carried the box to the elevator myself. The aides offered, but I waved them off. I didn't want help. I wanted to feel the weight of it, the ridiculous smallness of what I was taking with me after building an empire of glass and steel. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in years, I was alone in silence that wasn't crushing, but clean. By the time I reached the lobby, news had already spread. Faces turned, whispers followed, cameras rose like weapons. I ignored them all. I walked past the marble, past the flags, past the polished emblems of a company that no longer belonged to me. At 4:03, my signature left the company. At 4:07, I was in my car, the box on the seat beside me, driving toward the only place that still knew my name. The skyline shrank behind me in the mirror, each tower a monument to compromises I would no longer carry. Ahead lay the road, long and uncertain, stretching toward salt-stained windows, pressed leaves, and a lighthouse beam that had once flickered in a storm. And though I did not yet know it, the night the light went dark was waiting for me still. Memory is a dangerous thing. It doesn't just fade, it edits. It cuts and splices until the story you tell yourself is cleaner, kinder, easier to bear. I had carried such a story with me for decades, polished smooth like a stone in a pocket. I told myself I had meant to mail it, that if the storm had been less violent, if the door had opened, if fate had given me half a chance, Ivy would have held that letter in her hands. I told myself that what followed, the silence, the distance, the years of unanswered spaces, was the sea's fault, or the storm's, or the cruel hand of chance. I meant to. I would whisper when the memory stung too sharply. I tried. But meaning and doing are oceans apart. For years, I rehearsed the scene as though it had been written in stone. The storm raged. I clutched the envelope. The door would not open. I saw the silhouette in the beam, unreachable, untouchable, and then it was gone. After that, nothing could have been done. That was the script I carried. That was the truth I swore by. Only it wasn't the whole truth. The mind has ways of sealing off what cuts too deeply, of jamming doors it doesn't want opened. But time loosens such wedges. And when I returned to the lighthouse, when I stood once more in those salt-stained halls, I felt the old lock begin to turn. It began with a sound. A memory I had never admitted into my script before. The scrape of wood on stone. Not the storm's howl, not the bell's toll, but something closer, smaller. A deliberate sound. And with it came a flash I had long buried, my father's hand. That night, while I pushed against the lighthouse door, while my small fists beat against swollen wood, my father was on the other side. He was the one who had wedged it shut. The thought shook me. It went against every story I had told myself. For years I had believed it was chance, bad hinges, storm-swollen timber. But no, the wedge had been deliberate. A man's decision, not nature's cruelty. And suddenly, all my old rehearsals rang false. Because the truth was this: my father had seen me slipping out with the letter. He had known what I meant to do, and he had stopped me. The memory sharpened, piece by piece. His voice echoing just before, "Stay put, Grant." His eyes stern, not panicked. The scrape of wood as he pressed the wedge beneath the door. His silhouette in the glow of the keeper's lamp. Not ignorance, intention. He had not kept me inside for cruelty. He had done it to protect me from the lightning, from the slick stones, from the fury of the sea. But in protecting me, he had also stopped me from crossing the beam that night. Stopped me from reaching the silhouette who waited. And in that instant, my rehearsed story collapsed, because now I knew who the silhouette had been. It was Ivy. She had gone to the lighthouse, braved the storm, stood in the light itself, waiting for me to bring my answer. She believed in me enough to stand there, trusting that I would come. And I hadn't. The letter never reached her. Not because I hadn't meant to, not because of a swollen door or a cruel storm, but because my father, in his protective love, had wedged the door shut. And so Ivy waited. She waited until the lamp faltered, flickered out for that single heartbeat. She took the darkness as her answer. She believed silence was my reply. That knowledge cracked something in me deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever had. I hadn't been rejected. I had been late, but the truth was messier still, because memory doesn't give you clarity all at once. It comes in shards, painful, reluctant. Alongside the wedge and the silhouette, another image surfaced. The letter itself, sodden and blurred. My father had found it. He had taken it from me after the storm, when I was shivering and ashamed, when words stuck like stones in my throat. He had taken the soggy envelope home, laid it carefully by the fire to dry. I remember now faintly his hand smoothing the paper, his face heavy with something more than exhaustion. He meant to speak to me in the morning, meant to ask what words I had sealed with red wax, but that morning never came. A sharp pain had gripped his chest, his first heart scare. Not a collapse, not a death, but enough to slow him, to fill the house with worry, to push aside all other matters. The letter slipped into a chest in the attic, forgotten among old tools and ledgers. Life ran on its rails. Ivy, meanwhile, had left something too. She had written a reply. She had placed it at the keeper's desk, her words folded into an envelope, waiting for me. But when she returned the next day, it was gone. No one knew where it had gone. To her, it must have seemed the final insult, my silence answered by my indifference. But that too had been misread. Her reply had not vanished into air. It had been taken, tucked, hidden. And years later, it was waiting still. It is strange how truth arrives. Not in full daylight, but in fragments, like lightning that shows you one jagged line of coastline at a time. You never see the whole shore, just enough to know the map you trusted is wrong. I had lived by a wrong map for most of my life. I thought the storm had stolen my chance, thought Ivy's silence was her decision, thought my father's wedge had been nothing but cruel inevitability. But standing again in the lighthouse, tracing my hand along the old door, I remembered differently. My father had taken the letter. That fact clung to me like salt on skin. I could almost see it now, him lifting the sodden envelope from my hands after the storm, his fingers trying to smooth the wrinkles, the red wax softened, but still intact. He had not thrown it away. He had not mocked me for writing it. He had done what fathers do, tried to protect both me and my words, even if he did not understand them. I imagine him carrying it home, setting it carefully near the hearth, hoping the heat would dry the ink instead of smudging it further. I imagine his plan to speak in the morning, to ask me who it was for, to decide whether to place it in Ivy's hands or keep it safe. He would have done it with his usual mixture of sternness and care, the way he did everything. But the morning betrayed him. A pain had struck his chest, sudden and sharp. Not a heart attack, not the end, but enough to frighten him into stillness. Enough to keep me close, enough to fill the house with worry. In that haze, the letter was set aside, slipped into a chest in the attic, between old logbooks and rusted tools. Life ran on rails, and the rails carried it forward without pause for a soggy envelope. The truth was cruel in its simplicity. The letter had not been destroyed or rejected. It had been misplaced, swallowed by time, hidden by a man who meant to protect. And while I thought silence was Ivy's reply, she thought silence was mine. Her side of the story comes to me now in shards of memory and fragments of her words from later years. She had gone to the lighthouse that night because she believed. She believed I would come, that I would bring my answer. She waited in the beam, drenched by the storm, her heart loud in her chest. And when the lamp faltered, when the light vanished, for that single breath, she took it as her answer. Darkness had spoken where I had not. Still, she left her own reply. A folded envelope, pressed into the wood of the keeper's desk. Perhaps she thought I would find it in the morning. Perhaps she believed the silence could still be broken by ink. But her reply vanished. She returned days later, searching, and found nothing. To her, it must have seemed as though I had not only refused to speak, but discarded her words as well. The cruelest misreading of all. 2 letters, each lost, each unread, each convincing the other that silence was chosen. And for years, neither of us spoke. I kept the blank notebook she had given me. I kept the watch my father had trusted to me. I even kept the memory of the silhouette. But I did not keep the truth, because I had buried it too deep. Now, decades later, I held a brass key in my hand, a key that had belonged to my father, found among his things after his passing. At first I thought it useless, a relic of some tool chest or forgotten drawer. But as I explored the lighthouse, once more I noticed something I had never seen as a boy. A small wall box, paint-sealed, tucked in the corner of the office. Its lock was old, its hinges nearly rusted shut. The key slid in with surprising ease. It turned. The box creaked open, releasing a sigh of stale, damp air. Inside was an envelope, mildewed, the ink faded, the paper fragile as cobweb. But her handwriting was still there. Ivy's, her reply, waiting all these years, sealed in silence. The envelope was soft with age, edges curling, the paper warped by years of damp. I held it as though it might dissolve in my hands, as though even breathing too hard would scatter it into dust. Her handwriting, yes, unmistakably hers, looped across the front. My name, Grant. For a long while, I could not open it. My fingers traced the ink, trembling as though this fragile thing contained all the weight of the life I had lived since that storm. And in a way, it did. It was proof that I had not been forgotten, that she had spoken, that silence had not been her choice, but only the accident of mislaid paper. I broke the seal as gently as I could. The flap lifted with a sigh, and inside was a single page, folded. Once, edges stained. The words were faded but legible, as though time itself had tried to erase them, but failed. Grant, I came because I believed you would. I waited in the light until it faltered. When it went dark, I thought I had my answer. But still I leave this, in case I was wrong, in case you meant to speak but could not. If you have nothing to say, I will not ask again. But if you do, you know where to find me. That was all. Not anger, not accusation. Just a hand stretched out across the storm. I read it again and again until the words carved themselves into me. Each time, the ache grew sharper because I saw now how wrong I had been. All these years, I believed she had rejected me, that she had turned away, that silence was her weapon. But the truth was different, gentler and crueler. She had waited. She had spoken. And I had been too late to hear. The image of that night returned in unbearable clarity. My father wedging the door, his hand pressing wood against stone to keep me safe. His face drawn with love and fear. The silhouette in the light, Ivy's shape blurred by rain, standing brave in the beam. the lamp faltering, the darkness falling. And in that single breath of dark, everything had been misread. She thought my silence meant refusal. I thought her absence meant rejection. In truth, we had both spoken, just not in words the other could hear. I pressed the mildewed page to my chest, eyes closed, feeling the weight of decades. How many choices had I made since then with this wound guiding me? How many times had I chosen ambition over closeness, telling myself I had been denied once, so why risk it again? How much of my life had been shaped by a silence that was never real? For a long time I sat in the keeper's office, the reply spread before me, the lighthouse groaning under the wind as it always had. Dust and salt clung to the air. The lamp above was dark now, retired, no longer the guardian of ships. But in my mind it flickered alive again, just for a moment, showing me Ivy's face in the storm. I thought of my father too. His protective love, his instinct to keep me from danger. He had not known what I carried. He had not known what it meant to her, or to me. He had acted as fathers do with love that can sometimes wound as much as it shields. He had found the soggy letter, tried to save it, then tucked it away when illness and duty crowded out all else. He had not meant to steal my words. He had simply been late. Too late to explain. Late to see how silence grows like rot if left too long. And Ivy, poor Ivy, she had left her words, and when they vanished, she believed I had cast them aside. She bore that quiet hurt while I bore mine, and the years built walls where once there had only been a door. The truth was simple and devastating. It wasn't only negligence. It wasn't only silence. It was protective love, bad timing, and two young hearts misreading the dark. I gathered the letter, fragile as breath, and placed it beside the stitched notebook and the dented watch. 3 relics now, each carrying its truth. The creed, the promise, the words lost and found. For the first time, I felt the weight of them not as regret, but as guidance. Because if the sea forgives no one, then maybe the shore still can. Maybe, even after decades, there was a chance to speak aloud what had been unsaid. The storm outside pressed against the glass, but inside me a different storm began to still. And the words came, quiet but certain. I hadn't been rejected. I had been late. The fight for the lighthouse should have been simple, at least on paper. A relic, long decommissioned, standing on the cliffside as a reminder of a different era. Developers wanted the land. Investors wanted their margins. And for a while, I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. The sea had claimed worse than a crumbling tower. But when you have lived your life haunted by a silence, when you have carried a soggy letter in your pocket for decades, you learn what symbols mean. The lighthouse wasn't just stone and glass. It was a covenant. My father had kept it. Ivy had waited in it. And I had failed it. Now demolition crews were circling. The permits, I learned, had been accelerated by none other than Mercer. It was just like him, surgical, quiet, vindictive. He had funneled money into the project, not for profit alone, but for spite, to ensure that even after my resignation, the shadow of his creed speed beat sentiment would loom over me. The tower would fall, and with it, everything I had come back to reclaim. The town caught wind, and outrage sparked. Not everyone, of course. Some saw jobs in construction, revenue from condos, shiny progress where I saw ruin. But many remembered what the beam had meant. Fishermen whose fathers had sailed by its light. Widows who still placed flowers at the shore for men who never returned. Families who carried the stories of nights when the lamp had been their only hope. A public hearing was scheduled. The hall was small, its wooden rafters straining against years of sea air, but every bench was filled. Townsfolk muttered, shuffled, leaned forward in wary hope, or folded their arms in suspicion. At the front sat the developers' representatives, suited, smiling, promising responsible growth. And beside them, to my disgust but not surprise, Mercer himself, playing the role of financial benefactor. When my turn came, I rose slowly. The eyes that turned to me were not those of shareholders or analysts. They were the eyes of people who had known me as a boy, who had seen me leave with promises and return with wealth. Their trust was brittle, and I could feel it. "I won't waste your time," I began. My voice carried rougher than usual, stripped of polish. "You know who I am. You know I left. You know I came back with money, but not with honesty. That's on me. I won't pretend otherwise." The murmurs quieted. I set a folder on the table. "Here's what I'm prepared to do. I'll seed a community trust, enough to maintain the lighthouse and the surrounding land. Not in my name, but in the town's. The deed will pass into a heritage conservancy. It won't belong to me. It won't belong to the company. It will belong to you all. Of you and to those who come after." There were nods, skeptical but listening. Then I pulled something else from my coat. An envelope, mildewed, its ink faded. I held it up. "This," I said, "was a letter. Not mine but Ivy's, lost in the lighthouse for decades. Words I should have read long ago. I want to read one line now, so it doesn't vanish again." My fingers shook as I unfolded it. The words were faint, but still legible. "If your heart is people, the light is yours." Silence filled the hall. Not applause, not jeers. Just silence. The kind that means people are weighing what they've heard, measuring it against years of memory. I swallowed. I failed to answer those words when they were written. I failed Ivy, and I failed this town when I vanished into wealth instead of returning with truth. But I won't fail now. If my name means anything, let it mean this. The light will remain not as mine, but as ours. The silence broke into a low rumble. Some clapped, some nodded, some still frowned. But the air shifted. The lighthouse was no longer a forgotten ruin on a cliff. It was once again a question of covenant, of who kept the promise. And for the first time in years, I felt I was keeping one. The applause in the hall was uneven, some clapping politely, some still stiff with doubt. I knew it would be. You don't erase decades of absence with one pledge, no matter how grand. And then Ivy stood. The room shifted around her, as if every bench, every breath, tilted in her direction. She hadn't taken a seat near me, but in the middle of the crowd, as though refusing any special place. Her presence alone was enough to still the murmurs. She looked at me, not cold, not warm, but with a gaze so steady it unsettled me more than Mercer's polished scorn ever had. "I believe you mean it," she said at last. Her voice was clear, carrying without force. "But I won't be an accessory to another savior story." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Ivy continued, "Too many times men with power have come back here and claimed to give something to the people, as if the people didn't already own their own history. This town doesn't need a redeemer. It needs someone who will stay. Someone who will stand in the light without trying to own it." Her words struck harder than any financial loss ever had. Because she was right. Everything I had offered, even the trust, the conservancy, still framed me as the one holding the pen, the one doling out protection. Ownership disguised as generosity. "Can you stay," she asked, "without owning everything?" The question hung heavy. I reached for the watch in my pocket, felt its steady tick. My father's creed whispered back to me, people over profit, timber over tin. He had kept the light not because it was his, but because it was needed. Could I do the same? I stepped to the table again. "Yes," I said simply. From the folder, I withdrew another set of papers, documents, prepared by the lawyers I still kept on retainer, though I rarely listened to them. I slid them across the table, open for all to see. "These are my personal shares," I said. "Everything I still hold from the company. I'm signing them into the community trust, along with the deed to the lighthouse property, with a reversion clause. That means no one, not me, not any board, not any corporation, can ever take it back once it's done. It belongs to the town. Permanently. Gasps broke out across the hall. This was no symbolic gesture. It was wealth, real and liquid, being. Bound in ink and law to something larger than me. I picked up the pen. My hand shook slightly as I signed my name, line after line, the ink drying into finality. Each stroke felt like a piece of armor falling away. When it was done, I set the pen down and looked back at the crowd. This isn't mine anymore, I said. And it never should have been. For a moment, there was quiet. Then a smattering of applause, hesitant but growing until the rafters shook with it. Not adulation, no one here was kneeling to a hero, but acknowledgement. Transparency, at last. That was when Mercer struck. He rose smoothly, the predator scenting blood. A touching gesture, he said, his voice calm but edged with disdain. But let's not pretend this is anything more than theater. You all saw the headlines. Hollis's hesitation, Hollis's weakness, Hollis's failure. This is damage control, nothing more. He has no power left. And once this town ties itself to his name, you'll inherit his liabilities. He turned to the cameras lining the back wall. The regulators will have their questions. Shareholders will have theirs. This is nothing but sentiment dressed. As stewardship, I should have wilted under the glare. Once, I would have, but not now. I reached into the box at my side and withdrew another file. You're right about regulators, I said. That's why I've already invited them. The hall rippled with surprise. I laid the file open, pages of traced funding, transfers, and signatures. This is the paper trail of where the demolition permits came from. The shell accounts. The lobbying dollars, the private transfers. All of it leads back to you, Mercer. Gasps again, this time sharper. Mercer's jaw tightened. You wanted to bury the light to spite me, I continued, my voice steady. But you left footprints. In the sand. And I'm not here to bury anything, I'm here to expose it. I turned back to the townsfolk, not with speeches, with proof. The applause that followed was different this time, not hesitant, not polite. Strong, deliberate, rolling through. The hall like surf breaking on stone. It wasn't for me. Not really. It was for the act itself, for something rare in both boardrooms and town halls. Transparency. When the hearing ended, the hall emptied slowly, townsfolk lingering in clusters, speaking in low voices. Some touched my shoulder in passing, others only nodded. A few still kept their distance. I didn't blame them. Trust wasn't something that came in a single afternoon. It was something earned and tied in time. Ivy didn't approach me in the hall. She slipped out with the others, her figure weaving into the crowd. I let her go. I knew she'd come when she was ready or not at all. The choice was hers, as it should have been all along. That night, after the paperwork had been delivered and notarized, I walked alone to the lighthouse. The sea wind cut sharp, the stones slick with mist. The tower stood dark now, its great lamp long since retired, but in the moonlight its outline was still fierce, still defiant against the horizon. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and salt. Dust swirled in my lantern's glow. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking with memory. At the keeper's desk, I set down the things I had carried back to this place. My father's dented watch, Ivy's long-lost reply, and the stitched notebook she had given me. For years, that notebook had been mostly blank, a symbol of my failure to write truth. But in the weeks since my resignation, I had begun to fill its pages at last. Not with polished speeches or investor notes, with names. I had written the names of workers at the plant, the welder who spoke of the lamp, the machinist with hands like oak, the young apprentice who carried her father's lessons like scripture. I had written the names of townsfolk who had stood up in the hearing, voices rough with salt and years. And I had written the story of my own resignation, plain and unvarnished, not for headlines but for record. Ivy found me there. Her footsteps were soft on the stairs, but I knew them. When she appeared in the doorway, lantern light caught her face, and for the first time in years, I did not see the distance of silence between us. I saw only the girl who once left pressed leaves and library books so they wouldn't be lonely. I slid the notebook across the desk toward her. "This is yours," I said. She hesitated, then opened it. Her fingers brushed the pages, lingering on the inked names. I watched her eyes move across the lines, her lips parting slightly as she read. "No speeches," I murmured. "Just truth." She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The only sound was the sea grinding against the rocks below. At last she looked at me. "You've changed." "I'm trying," I said. Her gaze lingered, searching me. Then she nodded once, small but firm. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was something stronger acknowledgement that I was finally standing where I should have stood all those years ago, not in wealth, not in absence, but here, in the light. We stepped out onto the gallery together. The night air was raw, the sea restless. The lamp above us was dark, but the horizon glowed faintly with moonlight. I rested my hands on the rail. "The light isn't a tower," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "It's what you owe the people who stand in it." For once, the words didn't feel like speeches. They felt like truth. The sea roared, unchanging, unforgiving. But inside me, something had shifted. Not redemption, not perfection, just a steadiness I had not felt since I was a boy. The light would remain not because I owned it, not because I saved it, but because I had finally learned what it demanded: presence, honesty, and the courage to stay. Time is not a circle, though sometimes it feels that way. It is more like the tide rolling out, returning, carrying back what was thought lost, depositing it in new shapes. Years passed after the hearing, and the town remade the lighthouse not with capital or spectacle, but with their own hands. You could see the change in every board replaced, every window cleared of salt. Fishermen painted the outer walls between. Trips to sea. Retired carpenters climbed ladders with brushes and hammers. Children carried buckets of sand to scour the brass rails. It wasn't the kind of renovation that appears in magazines, no glossy sheen, no corporate ribbon cutting, but it was alive, piece by piece. When the lamp turned again, it wasn't the blazing power of old. It was softer, smaller, a symbolic beam, but it was steady. That mattered more. I had the watch repaired during that time. The jeweler polished its case, replaced the worn spring, smoothed the glass. But I asked him to keep the dent. He looked at me strangely, said most men wanted flaws erased, but I told him the dent was the point. It reminded me of my father's hand, his creed, and the night when everything almost broke. Some scars you carry, not as shame, but as compass. And so when the wedding came, it was not with trumpets or press or boardroom fanfare. It was at dawn, the sea still wrapped in mist, the lighthouse standing behind us like an old witness. A few benches were set in the grass, their legs sinking slightly into the earth. No photographers, no velvet aisle, no orchestra. Just the town, gathered in coats against the morning chill, waiting quietly. Ivy wore a simple dress, ivory linen that caught the pale light. She carried no bouquet, only the stitched notebook, bound now with a ribbon. Her hair had silver strands, her face lines carved by time, but she walked toward me with the same steady grace as the girl who once pressed ivy leaves between pages so books wouldn't be lonely. Our vows were not grand. We did not promise eternity or perfection. We promised presence. She said, "I will not vanish when it storms." I said, "I will not mistake silence for your answer again." The efficient, An old neighbor who had once mended nets with my father nodded. "That's enough," he said, and bound our hands with a strip of rope, the kind used to tie boats to docks. When we kissed, the mist broke. The first beam of sunlight slid over the horizon, lighting the sea in gold. The lighthouse behind us glowed faintly, its restored lens catching the morning. The town clapped, not loud, not raucous, but with the rhythm of approval, like the steady clap of waves against stone. The reception was no ballroom gala. It was a potluck in the town square. Long tables set with mismatched cloths, dishes steaming, with casseroles, pies, chowders, roasted fish. Children darted between benches, stealing biscuits from plates. Old men lifted fiddles and squeezed accordions. No one asked for speeches. We simply ate and laughed and remembered. Ivy and I sat, side by side, sharing bites from the same plate, our chairs angled toward the sea. For the first time, I felt not like a man being watched, measured, or judged, but like one among many, ordinary and good. It was enough, more than enough. The morning after the wedding, the town was quiet again. The benches had been stacked, the dishes washed, the fiddles returned to cases. Only the gulls remained loud, wheeling over the shore as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not in spectacle, not in grand ceremony, but in the quiet certainty that Ivy and I had chosen. Presence over absence, steadiness over silence. We walked together to the lighthouse, hand in hand. The path was still damp from the sea, stones slick with dew. The tower loomed ahead, freshly painted, its gallery rail gleaming from the polish of volunteer hands. For the first time in my life, it did not look like a relic or a monument. It looked like a home. Inside, the air was cleaner now, the mildew scrubbed away, the walls bright with new plaster. Children had painted small murals along the stairs, waves, stars, even clumsy portraits of the lamp. Their laughter still seemed to echo faintly, a mark left behind like Ivy's pressed leaves in old books. At the keeper's desk, Ivy opened the stitched notebook. She flipped past the names I had written, the workers, the townsfolk, the stories of resignation, and stopped at the last blank page. From her pocket, she drew a single ivy leaf, fresh and green, its veins delicate as lace. She pressed it flat against the paper, smoothed it with her palm, and closed the cover. "Books shouldn't be lonely," she said, echoing her younger self. "Neither should promises." Her words settled in me like a tide returning to shore. I leaned forward and kissed her forehead, the watch ticking in my pocket like applause. That afternoon, we wrote our first letter together. Not to each other, we no longer needed the distance of paper, but to a boy in town who had earned a scholarship to study engineering. His family didn't have the means for the travel, the books, the quiet expenses that often break a dream before it begins. So we wrote him a letter, enclosing the first check from the community trust. Ivy wrote the opening line in her careful hand, "You are seen, and you are not alone." I added the closing, "Carry the light forward." We sealed it, stamped it, and together we walked it to the post. When the envelope slid into the box, I felt something loosen in me. After all the letters lost, the silences mistaken, this one had found its way into the world. We stood outside as dusk fell. The lighthouse beam flickered to life, steady now, sweeping across the darkening sea. A group of children ran in and out of the keeper's door, their laughter ringing, the hinges no longer swollen with neglect. The door did not stick anymore. It opened easily and closed softly, and the sound of it was like music. Ivy slipped her arm through mine. Together, we watched the beam turn, slow and sure, across the water. I thought of my father, who had believed the light was a promise kept. I thought of the boy I had been, clutching a letter in the storm. I thought of Ivy, waiting in the rain, leaving behind words I never saw until it was too late. And then I thought of now of us, standing here, not redeemed, not perfect, but present. I cleared my throat, the old man's voice I had carried through the telling returning for its final word. "We married at the light not because it saved us," I said quietly, "but because it demanded we save each other." The sea surged against the rocks as it always had, as it always will. The beam turned, and in that moment, I understood something I had spent a lifetime missing. If you're lucky, love doesn't make you young again, it makes you finally on time.